It's a great pleasure to welcome Marco Buti to have this conversation today. He's been DG for Economic and Financial Affairs for more than 7 years and works directly with the EU Commissioner competent in this field, Pierre Moscovici. Before that, Mr. Buti served in a number of prominent positions in the Directorate-General for Economic and Financial Affairs. He was also an economic advisor to the President of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, until 2003. What makes it particularly, I think, fun and interesting to talk with Marco in this context is that really I sense that you're an academic economist at heart. Trained at the Universities of Florence and Oxford, been a visiting professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the University of Florence and the EUI, and a regular contributor to Vox EU, the great website for the crossover of academic research into policy and into general discourse. And you can see there are a number of really fascinating papers in which Marco treads the line between, as it were, his position at the heart of power in Europe and his desire to articulate a coherent analysis of the economic situation in Europe. It's an absolutely fascinating dance to see. He's published extensively on fiscal and monetary policy and co-edited the Euro, the first decade, which appeared with CUP in 2010. So this is going to be an on-the-record conversation. We're going to be videoing it. And please join me in welcoming Marco to Cullom. The way we'll proceed is that I'll start out with a few general questions to let Marco, as it were, frame the discussion for us a little bit. Then see how the conversation goes up here, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions from your side. One of the things you told us over lunch, which is a remarkable fact, which you insisted, and we will follow you in this, in not interpreting in causal terms. But one of the things you pointed out to us at lunchtime was that you took up your possession as DG of ECOFIN more or less in the week of the Lehman crisis. And what I would be interested to know is how you see the development really of the European Union and above all perhaps the Eurozone in the years since then, and how, since we're in the US here, and I know that yesterday you were discussing the contrast between Europe and America at the New York Fed, how perhaps you see Europe's fortunes as contrasting with those of the United States.
Okay, thanks Adam. Thank you all in Columbia and the European Institute for hosting this talk. I mean, it's a welcome end of a quite tiring week because starting with the spring meetings of the IMF in Washington and then crossing over this conference at the New York Fed meeting with investors this morning to take the temperature of how investors in Wall Street see Europe's challenges, and then having this talk here, which is, is the one of all these events I like most. I hope I'll be able to say that also after the event. Now, I think the question of taking a bit of a longer-term perspective, looking backwards. We were hit by the crisis which originated in this country here, but crossed over to Europe in a situation of incomplete integration, incomplete monetary union. So this is what happened. The Maastricht Treaty and the kind of policy setting was not for designed for this type of crisis, this type of shock. And the polity was not sufficiently, sufficiently cohesive and responsive in order to devise a response which, after the first moment of bouleversement, could give a structured answer to that. Actually, you were recalling some of the little pieces that I have done in Vox, summarized a bit more, more serious research. One of the points that I emphasize in looking now at the policy response, what continues to be a problem in to put in place the right policy strategy are the different narratives that you have in Europe and you have also within the Eurozone. So I think one of the objectives actually on which we continue to work now and we continue to push member states is indeed to come to a joint narrative. And the fact that there are different narratives, I think, finds its roots in the good years before the crisis. So what happened at the time was that we introduced the euro. We had the typical benefits effect on German competitiveness on the one hand, because you did not have the classic appreciation of the Deutschmark, which tempered the competitiveness. So they became more and more competitive and more intensive in tradables. On the other hand, you have countries of the southern rim, traditionally with higher inflation and higher interest rate, which saw the interest rate coming down, and this was the drug of underpinning the irrational exuberance of the first 10 years. And this one here had an anesthetic effect, and the issue of structural reforms, adapting your economy, your markets, your labor markets, etc., to live within monetary union, the pressure for that went down. So, but the point here, which I think we have, which still haunting us, is the fact that this lasted for 10 years. And over 10 years, this initial difference has crystallized in economic structures on the supply side, which diverged, more intensive in tradables and competitiveness on the, let's call it Germany and those around Germany, and more intensive in non-tradables in the southern country. And since it lasted so long, it permeated also social and political preferences. So it was not only an economic issue, it was a question of social and political preferences reflected also in values. So the kind of somewhat ugly debate that we have and we have had in the past years, let's say on Greece, finger pointed with the typical stereotypes, and in Germany, Schuld as debt and guilt, etc., were actually crystallized in the first 10 years of it. So the difficulty in providing a fully fledged response when the crisis hit was due also to this element here. So it has been a process of rebuilding based on let's say fundamentals. By here I'm talking not only of economic industrial fundamentals, but fundamentals related to social preferences, which with structural preferences, and then also in a sense reflected in the political preferences, which made hard to find a common ground. So if you take this perspective here and you look what has been done since the beginning of the crisis, with putting in place the European Stability Mechanism to dealing with shocks, the beginning and good part of banking union, also which sharing quite a lot of sovereignty there. If you think about the point of departure in what has been done, I find actually probably with a certain bias that having been lived from the inside, pretty extraordinary, considering the kind of premises which were of that time.
So I'm tempted to say this is in many ways quite reminiscent of the kind of argument that we heard from Martin Sandbu, the well-known economics correspondent for the Financial Times, who's been here in the last year. And he would add to that very interesting analysis of structural difference and the structural differences resulting from the Eurozone's development, policy failure. I mean, he would add basically a series of missed opportunities in the handling of the EU crisis, which in the end have produced a very divergent path between the United States and Europe. As a historian, it's very difficult to think of any previous period in which the macroeconomic development of the US, as modest as it is, diverged as strongly as it does now from that of the EU. I mean, these are very large, not in absolute terms, but in percentage terms, the difference between Europe's stagnation and America's more than 0.5% growth is very large indeed. So I guess, as far as you feel able to speak frankly about this, it would be very interesting to hear, perhaps let's put it this way, what you see as the missed opportunities in the handling of the crisis. New York certainly is one of the great capitals of Eurozone criticism, and we have a fine line here of Eurozone critics, whether this establishment or other places on the island of Manhattan. We know what their arguments are about the failures of EU policy. It would be quite interesting, I think, to hear from inside the Commission how you see the moves, or maybe to put it more neutrally, what the path-determined tracks were that locked the EU into a growth performance, which in the end has turned out to be very disappointing. Granted, your case, that under difficult circumstances, really quite radical changes have been made in some of the weakest economies under the most severe pressure. Other moments for you where you see, as it were, turning points?
Okay, now, first of all, to underpin what you have just said, I mean, this is a graph, you may have a different incarnation of this, you may have seen it. So this is the US and the Eurozone, and you see the recoveries, the current one, so it's of the 2009, and the previous say important crises, important recessions. They say not business cycle fluctuations, but important ones. And what you can see is that what is common across the Atlantic is the slowness of the recovery. So, in a sense, this is comforting and discomforting at the same time. Comforting, you say, well, we are on the same boat. So it's not that there has not been a stellar performance of the US compared to previous. And if one looks, indeed, you look at business investment, it has revived a bit recently, but it's not been. Labor market certainly doing considerably better than Europe. But you look at now the controversial debate in the Fed whether they should proceed with the normalization of interest rate policy or not. I mean, they look at productivity has been pretty unsatisfactory. At the same time, you can see that there is a difference between Europe and the US. Now, I've tried to see. Let me see if I here. Yeah, I mean here now I've tried to list. I mean, what you have in the debates of the reasons, potential reasons why the recovery has been slow, and why in differential terms we have done worse than the US, and you have the various arguments here. Now, if and we have studied the relative importance of these elements here. I mean, I think on this side of the Atlantic, you would naturally have more on the first group, the austerity. So, in part, that is true, but only in small part. And actually, if one looks at the behavior of the various measures of the fiscal stance across the Atlantic, you take the estimated difference in the structural deficit, so netting out the cyclical effects over the period. The US and Europe have had, in average, the same stance. So, the same stance. There has been some more anti-cyclicality in the US compared to Europe, in particular after Europe was struck by the sovereign debt crisis.
Just to explain for our audience, the Obama stimulus of 2009 in response to the 2008 crisis in America was larger than...
It was larger, but we did also a stimulus, it was larger.
Yeah. But then there isn't another big fiscal stimulus when the Eurozone crisis hits in 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
So that then counts.
So that is the thing. And in fact, with the sovereign debt crisis, a number of countries which basically lost market access or were threatened to lose market access have no choice but to restrain policy. But overall, if you take for the average, for the Eurozone as a whole, it would not have this as flashing as the issue. I think certainly it has been more anti-cyclical or less pro-cyclical in the US, but to an extent it is not the big issue. I think what has been I think very important in all this, it is not written. I could have expressed it in a more explicit fashion, but is what underlines basically the third bullet here, which is that we did not fix the problems of the banks at the outset. This is I think what I mean the original sin. We carry that with us. And again, why did we not do so? I think maybe misdiagnosis, maybe in part the explanation of this, but it's not the main explanation. I think the main explanation is the fact that we did not have the basic infrastructure which is codified in a banking union, and the capacity to, let's say, to see issues of in the banking sector for a system-wide euro area perspective. So basically here the response was, okay, you have your problems in the banks, you treat it yourself. So each country on its own. If you do not have that, then you go for an EU IMF program, and this was the case for a number of small countries, Ireland in particular, in part also Spain. For other countries like Italy, who did not have an immediate, let's say, pressure in the first place, the problem that was there left lingering, and then this has been, let's say, when the recovery came, the banking system was not in the position to accompany the recovery with enough flow of credit, and this market instability and threats to investor sentiment was remained very perceptible. So I think if one looks back and try to retrace my own experience on this, of all the various things, I could have corrected. Basically, I could have corrected in every single bullet. We did not do things perfectly. But I think the fixing the banks and put much more pressure on that. At the outset of the crisis, I think we would have found ourselves in a better position now.
So American political scientists, when they make this comparison, I'm fascinated that you hone in on this. So the difference between the huge push between September and October 2008 already, and then in the second push with stress testing in the spring of 2009 to quickly cauterize and resolve and then recapitalize the American banking system. When political scientists and sociologists, admittedly mainly in the US, but some in France now as well, compare that experience with what happens in Europe, part of the answer is clearly there is a federal government in the United States with powers, though those are quite limited, and that is missing in the EU case. But they have, of course, powerful national governments that might have acted individually because they had decided to delegate. Oddly, the factor that American social scientists point to is the peculiar configuration of power between Washington and Wall Street. In other words, you have such an incestuous, such a tightly knit group in which, as it were, you have a former CEO of Goldman Sachs as Treasury Secretary. You have an incredible nexus of power in the United States, which enables essentially a collective solution. You don't have veto players on the outside of the big cartel in the US. Everybody's in, which is the crucial thing when you're recapitalizing, is not to allow outsiders. Whereas if you look at Britain, if you look at Germany with the role of Deutsche Bank in particular, there are powerful veto players who block comprehensive solutions. So if we push one level further, I guess isn't there an issue not just of political will, but also of the structuring of interest groups and the way in which they work? European banks persistently, all the way through to the fall of 2011 when the IMF was calling for it, pushed against collective recapitalization solutions with public funds. Isn't that also part of, certainly when you think about the perception of the EU, as you've stressed many times, one of its major problems is it's seen as an elite club. It's seen as unable to impose itself on powerful interest groups. Is this another case of precisely that? A kind of perverse failure, if you like, to impose itself on key groups when it was absolutely necessary to do so?
I think there is an element of truth in this. I mean, as a personal episode, I happened to be in Washington at the White House the day the stress tests were published. Or it was
this is in May 2009?
Yes, and I was there for consultations and other things, and then now, in retrospect, the stress tests at the time, the US stress tests, have been seen as a model of, let's say, for a very credible stress test. You have the stress test, you have the money with the target, and the two came together. A bit mysteriously, the capital needs coming out of the stress test were precisely matching the money set aside with the target, but whatever, you know. The result was very powerful. I have to say that the climate at the time I'd say in the White House, to say in the establishment of there, but also so in the, in certain rooms, there was very, very substantial nervousness.
Yes.
So the fact that now we see this as, let's say, a well-designed, extremely rational, well-planned, all staged in a perfect way. Let's say I did not have I didn't sense the atmosphere at the time. Things fell into the right place indeed, and ex post that was a turning point, I think, in the management of the crisis here. But then I think they took quite a lot of risks there. And as you say, maybe this incestuous relation, which is normally not a good one, maybe in that particular juncture may have helped. Now, in the case of Europe, okay, we did not have a powerful decision making at the central level. We did not have unique supervisors who could pinpoint progress across the euro area. So we had national supervisors, in certain cases captured. So the identification of the needs with the response, which could not take place on a country-by-country basis without external help, I think very much blocked the situation there. We have also the case clearly that in Europe, banks are much more, they have a higher weight in the economy than in the US. We are facing a problem of overbanking, and so this was also the structural nature of the issue, which made it more difficult to deal with in an emergency situation. I mean, what came up afterwards, and this we had to wait for the summer 2012 for, let's say, for acknowledging and clearly that you cannot have a banking union, a monetary union without a credible banking union, and so in a sense, the painful experience with the initial years of the crisis led to something which we are still in the middle of the river on the banking union side. We have heated discussions on the length on deposit guarantee, but certainly in terms of sharing sovereignty is as encompassing, if not even more, than the single currency itself to have a banking union.
So it is very fascinating to move forward perhaps from 2008-9 to that summer of 2012, where in a sense the Eurozone crisis reaches the end of its first phase. What, in retrospect, would you see as the crucial moments in that resolution and that restabilisation? Where should we place the emphasis? Is it a question of the banking policy that you just stressed, or what role should we accord to Mario Draghi's famous "whatever it takes" pronouncement that seems to have been so important in sort of consolidating the banking, the bond It's a story that goes on for 4 years longer than the crisis in the United States, but it does reach a certain sort of moment. This is a defining moment, presumably, in your narrative of constructive change. What are the elements that come together?
No, that was clearly a point of discontinuity. Whatever it takes, I would encourage you to look at the YouTube
yes.
And the fact that you had Mario, it was not only what he said it was the how.
Yes.
He said.
So he looks at the cameras.
He looks like he poses.
Yeah.
He says whatever it takes, and I, he says okay.
It's a kind of Schwarzenegger moment.
So
it's kind of made my day.
Now, I think that was a moment of discontinuity, clearly, because what was perceived, I think, by the market is that there was an assumption that the markets had taken and throughout that period till escalated in summer 2012, and it is the Eurozone is not there to stay. That was and I remember vividly, I mean, moments in which throughout the spring, the early summer, etc., one could see on the website of the FT the ticking of the clock with the live streaming of the Eurozone crisis, like when you have in a hold-up, or O.J. Simpson followed by the helicopter,
The hostage taker.
Yeah, the hostage taker, or whatever, all this kind of. So, with the message being that it's a question of certainly it's a question of hours, or days and weeks, far too long. So waiting for the collapse of the Eurozone happening anymore. This was the atmosphere at the time, and this is what markets actually expected. Now, I think what markets did not expect, and I think what was the turning point there, in a sense, with emblematic statement of Mario Draghi, was the political determination of leaders in very difficult circumstances, shoulders against the wall, maybe more in an act of self-preservation than of great strategic design, was political determination to say this is not going to happen. So in a sense, what Mario Draghi said at that moment was not only, at least from the point of view of the markets, was not only the ECB standing up to its responsibilities in terms of the response to at that moment, but in a sense the crystallization of this in the ECB statement of this willpower of the governments in Europe to say we have many disagreements, we still have a long way to go, we do not know how to go there, and maybe if we don't like to start from here to go there, but this is not going to happen. And I think the turning point there was this plastic assertion that the markets have underestimated the determination of the leaders in Europe to stand by their construction.
I mean, not the least remarkable thing about it is that, having said that, he has to do nothing. Right? The astonishing thing about the ECB balance sheet from that moment onwards is that it actually progressively shrinks, right? As the LTRO credits which are being extended are paid back, it's the Fed which is actually pushing with QE3 from the fall of 2012. And that, I think, sets up then the last phase and the most recent phase of the Commission's work that I'd love to ask you about before we open this out to the audience, which is that by 2014, there's still no growth, right? The Eurozone economy is stagnating in the way that you were describing. This is where the gap really begins to open up sharply with the US. And finally, we do see quantitative action by the ECB, but we also see the new Juncker Commission coming in with this promise of a new policy agenda. And it's that really that I want to ask you about, because we had Vice President Timmermans, First Vice President Timmermans here. This was very much on the agenda there as well. The issue of the investment program. I mean, if Europe needs growth, then it's not too old-fashioned, I think, to think that it needs not just productivity and tech and innovation and disruption and all of that, but it actually needs investment. And it needs a lot of investment. The estimates are about $1 trillion or euros shortfall in terms of infrastructure. Just like in the US, enormous potential for investment even in the rich world to get everywhere else. And the question, I guess, is how, under the current circumstances, those funds can be mobilized, given that there is also this general commitment to a new type of, well, let's call it austerity because that's a comfortable glyph, it's a polemical word, but fiscal restraint and an attention to the long-run deficit and debt problems of rich and aging countries. So the question is a kind of a new one, isn't it, I think, of a kind of smart investment-led policy which gives us some of the old bang of a government-led investment policy, but without the bucks that would tend to destabilise the budget. How is it that the Juncker Commission aimed, or still aims, to square this and to actually launch a government-initiated investment policy without an old-school Obama-style, New Deal-era, 70s-style fiscal policy? Because that's, as it were, to a conventionally minded person, a contradiction. And yet, you guys are convinced you've squared this. So how does it work?
Okay. Now, we were talking before about what could have been done differently, what was the points of failure, of disconnect. I think one element which haunted us in terms of the narrative of the crisis, which then clearly also led to a certain type of policy response, was an element of bad luck. Then one can say that bad luck, there is always a rational origin for that, but the bad luck for us was that the first country which came into the limelight with a big crisis was Greece. And the problem with Greece was that for Greece it is a fiscal crisis. So this tainted the reading of the also for in a sense there was that at that time a reading of the crisis due to the fiscal profligacy of a number of countries, which then created the premises for the problems later. Now, for Greece it is true. I mean, when we discovered all of a sudden that deficit was, instead of 2.8 was 60.5, was a bit of a shock. By the way, and if you allow me, I open and close a bracket immediately. In the initial phase of the crisis, and the problems with statistics in Greece are not new. They come. We went as Commission to the Council, so to the Member States for adoption, with a proposal for much more intrusive powers of Eurostat, so our statistical arm, to go to check the primary sources. This was after the first cheating of Greece. The Council, led by also the most rigorous countries, said no. Why? Because the fear was that you become too intrusive. Yeah. And then you come to check our numbers also, and we don't like all that much. So we had to wait. So there was a flat refusal. We had to wait for the latest crisis with the Greek statistics to eventually convince the Council to grant Eurostat powers of inspection, which were more pervasive than the first one. So I close the brackets to see that nobody's innocent in this game here. So now let's go back to the issue of the fiscal crisis. So I think in essence, the Eurozone crisis was not a fiscal crisis, apart from Greece, and actually it was much more of a crisis of, let's say, sudden stop after misallocation of capital and with the implications for the banking system rather than a fiscal issue per se. However, whether it is the effect rather than the cause, we are confronted now with very high levels of debt, so public and private. So the issue here has to, I mean, whether even if that was not the original sin, we find ourselves needing to deal with this issue in a situation in which, by the way, if you take indicators of sustainability looking forward, factoring in the impact of the demography, the situation in a number of countries look pretty hopeless. By the way, here also I would encourage you to look at our publication on the sustainability reports. Who is, the countries on top of the list of worries for in terms of long-term sustainability are not the usual suspects. So some actually will look in a better shape now, looking at the debt and deficit in the classic definition. When you factor in the implicit liabilities,
so pensions,
then these countries. I mean, I think I look at Italy in particular, having done a quite tough series of pension reforms. Actually, there is an issue here in the short to medium term, very high level of debt, which is a important worry. But then looking forward, once we have passed through this thing here, the situation is considerably better than in other countries. So we have to devise fiscal policy to to stimulate the economy in a situation of constraints, which are constraints in part due to the fiscal rules that we have, but more importantly, even more importantly, by the objective fiscal space that in certain cases is simply not there. So that's why the talk, which has been taking place also in Washington, which took place last week, try to devise smart policies, smart fiscal policies, which would not lead, to large increases in the budget deficit, but would, let's say, stimulate the economy in a more intelligent fashion. And I think what we are trying to do here is to have two objectives in devising these policies. One is to change the composition of the budgets or have targeted, let's say, fiscal stimulus for high multipliers expenditure items. So things that would activate the economy in the short term. So, and this brings also to the fore the issue of redistributive policies, because we know that the more you go into inequality, the more you have propensity to save, and then less stimulus in the short term to the long. So this one, and I think very important, the issue of budget components which help to stimulate productivity in the medium to long term. And here is related to material and immaterial investment, something that does not help only in the short term, but has the prospects to boost total factor productivity, looking forward. So this is the kind of smarter fiscal policy. So you do not have a large increase in the deficit, just digging holes and filling them, but targeting the way you want to boost. The Juncker plan comes into the picture here. I mean, basically, what we do with the Juncker plan is we have a system which let's say takes the first loss in risky projects to incentivize let's say the involvement of investors for more senior, say less risky ventures.
So it's like a financial engineering approach.
It is a financial engineering of the good sort.
Of the good kind.
Of the
good financial engineering.
So
you slice the project up and you take the riskiest.
We take the risk part. And why do I say this is important in terms of the smart fiscal policies? Because what you have is that typically productivity enhancing projects are high profitability but also high risk. there are things in innovation, new technology, which, if it goes well, you have a high return, but the likelihood that it fails, they are quite large. So there is a natural reticence on the part of investors to go into that. And second, this is compounded by the banks, as we discussed before, because the banks now exit the period of financial exuberance of the pre-crisis period with a much more sober behavior. So one cannot count on banks to finance this type of projects. So that's why, for this high profitability, high risk projects, having a system with a mechanism like in the Juncker plan by the European Fund for Strategic Investment, which takes the first loss, I think it has a potential for I think a large impact. Now, and I close here. Juncker plan has been criticized very widely. It is too small. You don't see
Can you tell us the ratios? Because the ratios are staggering. Because this really is financial engineering. It produces a huge leverage.
No, the ratio is 15, 1 to 15.
So you put 20 billion in and you get 350 billion
and
out.
that is basically the issue. Now, this looks very large. Yeah. Looks very large, it's not. What we have projects financed by the EIB, aside from the Juncker plan, I think they have. This is, I'm not saying it's a conservative multiplier or leverage ratio, but it is not outrageous, not out of range.
No, not really. I'm just explaining.
So it is. So one counts on that. Now, we have not seen yet the impact of or the visibility of the Juncker plan yet, because we are at a stage of signing the projects. So we have signed projects for about 80 billion, both for SMEs and for infrastructure projects. But this is signature, so they are not shovel ready. So we'll have to wait a few months to start to see the actual results. And I think while I'm critical on many things, I think on the Juncker plan we are going to be positively surprised. You invite me next year, we talk again, maybe you say that.
Yeah, so of the 315, you think you've got 80 million. It's a very good box EU piece. If you're sceptical, it's fascinating, read it. I've got a question from Perry here, then a colleague at the back, and the gentleman here.
If you would try to speak up.
Just shout. Yeah.
I can get a mic, 1 second.
I know you recorded.
Yes.
So, following on this discussion of the Juncker plan and connecting it to what you were saying earlier, that we discovered in the crisis that you really can't have a monetary union without a banking union, I want to ask about the proposal for capital markets union and the connection of that to the Juncker plan, possibly. Is this a road toward capital market union? Or is it instead of capital market union? Or where exactly is that discussion in Europe at the moment?
Okay, thanks for this question. It allows me to put things in a round manner. Indeed, as part of this European Commission strategic programs, this is capital market union is the new frontier. Now, Juncker plan, I have explained the first leg before, which is let's say this European Fund for Strategic Investment, so this financial mechanism. It has two other legs. A second leg is the identification of viable projects. So the pipeline of projects which could be actually financed, because often we are confronted with, you don't have resources, but plenty of resources, where are the projects? So we have worked a lot as Commission together with the European Investment Bank to identify viable projects. So this is the second leg. The third leg is let's say, removing the obstacles to investment in the member states on number of regulations, problems at the level of local authorities, sometimes not even the level of member states legislation, there's local legislation, and so on and so forth. So capital market union comes into this third leg. So it is, for instance, the launch of the securitization for SMEs, which allows the banks to be more conducive to give credit to SMEs and so on. So it is integrally connected to the plan to boost investment in Europe. Now, Capital Markets Union is a project for all the member states of the EU. So it's a EU28 dimension. So it's very much related to the completion of the financial market in the single market in the financial services area. But it has also an important implications for the working of the euro area, even though it is for everybody and not only for the eurozone. Okay, first of all, capital market union is important because we have this overbanking Europe I mentioned before, so we have to rebalance here. And the comparison across the Atlantic is staggering. I mean, 1 to 10 in venture capital, private equity, and other things. So, but for the working of the eurozone, capital market union is important because go back again to the pre-crisis period. As part of the narrative that I tried to identify before, we have had with the large current account imbalances within the eurozone, we had excess savings in a number of countries, okay, Germany in particular, and current account deficit in other countries. So there has been reallocation of capital from Germany to the other countries. In absence of well-developed capital markets, this has taken place via debt.
By the banks.
And by the banks. No? So, and clearly it has been misallocated with the absence of a common supervisor which will look at where capital goes, and the collusive interplay between supervisors and local authorities. So capital market union, once we will have achieved that, will have to reallocate the excess savings from, let's say, Germany and Netherlands and the other countries, not via debt, or not only via debt, but via equity. So it would imply clearly a more robust mechanism of adjustment within the eurozone, provided obviously that the recipient countries do the right things in terms of well-functioning economies, structural reforms, etc., which would have these prospects of high productivity, so that these excess savings via equity boost growth in these countries. So I think they make the robustness of the adjustment within the EMU more solid, to increase that, and also I think it would diffuse also to a certain extent the criticism of the persistent, very high current account surpluses that you have in Germany and other countries. These current account surpluses, they are clearly too high now, and we have to come down in the future. But Germany is going to remain a country with a current account surplus. Take the industrial configuration, take the demographic prospects. Germany is going to remain a country with sizable current account surplus, lower than the 8.5% of now, but still. So it is essential that we have this recycling mechanism within the eurozone to provide a smoother adjustment. So capital market union is key for the proper functioning of the EMU and over and above the single market perspective.
Thank you. That's great. We have the colleague from Princeton.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a question about the redistributive effects of this smart fiscal policy, which seems fascinating, but if the assumption is to have a more granular approach and to not expand the fiscal budget, then it has redistributive implications, right? So I would like to have, how feasible politically is it to implement fiscal reforms? On your first point, for example, implying that there is a transfer from high-income households to low-income households, would that take place on a national basis, or would that be the opportunity to implement any fiscal transfers? Everything is a matter of redistribution in this crisis, I guess. So Do you see it as a national, domestic, political, fiscal reform, and how feasible is it in the political context at the moment? And is there any opportunity for fiscal transfers across members? And yeah, and second question, which is very related, which sector, which economy? So in the second item, which is boosting TFP, with the, it looks very much like project finance, actually, what you were describing, right? So which economic sector would benefit, and which economic sector would not benefit? I mean, if you need to take money somewhere, which economic sector will mostly suffer?
Okay, you have too many questions.
There are two questions.
No, but there are two, but you have done the typical European trick. When we give two recommendations, we packed many sub-recommendations in. I recognize that trick very well. So okay, let me take the issue of smart fiscal policy. Now I think first of all, the redistributive / income policies have been taboo for many years. They have been taboo in general throughout the Western world. They have been taboo in particular in the European Union because it was considered that they do not pass the subsidiarity test. So it would not be something that the Union should be bothered with in the first place, because it's a question of preferences for the member states. No? That's why when Maastricht Treaty was signed up in 1992, for the fiscal rules it was taken two parameters, which was the public debt deficit, so 60% to 2%, which were considered as, let's say, as social preferences neutral as one can be. Now, nothing is social, is neutral from the point of view of preferences, not even monetary policy, and the discussion also. But let's say something which we did not talk about the let's say size of the government in the economy, and you have actually countries that are very different within the European social model, very different things. We did not talk about the composition. We did not talk about the relation between spending or composition of spending and composition of taxes and so on, because of these reasons here. I think now the issue of let's say the impact of fiscal policy on the economy is on the agenda, and the work by Olivier Blanchard and IMF colleagues a couple of years ago, or the estimates of multipliers, I think are particularly important. I think particularly important now that monetary policy is facing a zero lower bound. So they
show that fiscal policy works.
It works. The multipliers are higher.
Stimulates.
Stimulates.
And then if you shrink the net spending, it collapses the economy.
Yeah, indeed. So now at the same time, what we are working on here is, we have recommendations within what I don't want to sound too technocratic, but it's what we call the EU semester, and also the system of coordination that rolling on a rolling basis that we have where we can make recommendations for countries. And I think here, pushing countries, what we're suggesting that there is more preference for items which have these virtuous features, I think is part of it has become more accepted. And by the way, not only on this side of the Atlantic, but also in Europe, the concern of inequality looms large. So, in a sense, if you do something which is more redistributive, you can catch two birds, because you have, in a sense, you address some of the inequality issue, and at the same time, you increase the multipliers in the short, say in the short term. this does not mean transfers across countries. And in particular, it does not mean transfers on a permanent basis. This is something that Germany and others, I think, are not ready to accept. I don't think it is needed to have permanent transfers. What is being talked about here, and this is part of the work on the completion of economic monetary union following the report of the 5 presidents of last year, is as ultimate objective to have a euro area finance minister / ministry. So there, which will take let's say, important decision in terms of implementing the fiscal rules, in terms of let's say, managing let's say, risk-sharing mechanism, which may take the form of there have been several proposals. One of them is to have a top-up of unemployment benefits compared to the national level, and let's say, and also have an external representation, so a face and a telephone number for the euro area finance minister. So this is what is being talked about, and in terms of the items for be privileged within the budget, but here we talk about national budgets with the a progressive help to see on the EU budget side, if we could, for instance, on research and development top up what member states are doing, and these are the issues related especially to material investment, R&D, and the type of spending which are more conducive to the future.
You have a question here.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, but before I get to them, I want to put them in context so you know where I'm coming from. I'll try to go through my reasoning in 30 seconds or less. Going back to your description of the causes, you implied very strongly that basically Europe imported the problem from the United States. A lot of people would argue that in fact the Fed did create bubbles 3 times in the last 15 years. In that sense, you are almost certainly not completely correct. But I am fascinated by what I did not hear from you. I counted very carefully. You mentioned fiscal debt 3 times in Europe. You said nothing about private debt.
I did.
As a percent of GNP.
No, you have not taken
okay.
notes.
I will retract everything I said.
Okay, good.
Tell us more about it.
Talking about, since you're, particularly in places like France, private debt as a percentage of GDP has grown much more rapidly, let's say, than in Germany in the last 10 years. We are now, in some people's opinion, at a classic pushing on a string phase, i.e. it's having less and less effect. How far can this go? And my 2 questions, therefore, given this context, are: 1, is the end game possibly inflation, whatever it takes? And B, is there a potential role for gold in this ultimate solution? Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome to America.
Yeah. Yeah. No, okay, first of all, on the issue of private debt, I think maybe I was not clear enough before, but when I said that at least my view, shared, I would say, that by many economists, most, that the euro crisis is not in origin a fiscal crisis, is because basically we have had an accumulation of private debt in the period running to the crisis, and this is typical of Ireland, Spain, Eastern Europe. I mean, we tend to forget that the first crisis in Europe was not in the Eurozone. I mean, we remember the Baltics. They are there. It was, the irrational exuberance there is so you had in a different form not related to the boom in the housing market, but in Portugal also you have this accumulation of private debt. So I think it is more on that front than on purely on the public debt side. So just to put the record straight, I think this is part of my narrative. Now, your question on the gold destabilized me a little bit because because I thought we were heading towards somewhere else. Then gold popped up.
I'll explain it very, very quickly. In my simple mind, there are only three ways out.
Yeah.
Accepting the pain of deflation with everything that implies austerity, if you want. The Japanese method, very, 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 very slow disinflation. It's been going on for 25 years. And the third option is to take the easy way out eventually, to inflate your way out. And I don't mean just Europe, I mean the US included. Hence gold. That's the question.
Okay, I think, well, let me put it my way. On pushing on a string, I think there is an issue here, but it is in relation to having overburdened monetary policy because we did not use other instruments in a more effective manner. I don't think you agree with this, but never mind. If we go back now to last week, the communique of the G20 and the conclusions of the IMF meetings, I think there is a support for what we call the three-pronged strategy: monetary, fiscal, and structural reforms, and the clear feeling and the clear assessment that we have put too much on the shoulders of the central banks to deal with. So there has been an imbalance there. So the smart fiscal policy that we tried to describe before was also to complement the thing and to make sure that indeed the risk of pushing on a string do not occur. Now, I don't see any inflation neither here nor in the horizon. So I think the criticism there for certain quarters, and I take, I mean, in Europe institutionally is more the Bank for International Settlements, the criticism of overly expansionary monetary policy for too long are related to the issue on the one hand of financial instability and on the other hand of possible misallocation of capital coming from excessively low interest rates. This is not the narrative that mainstream central markets will take, but that is I don't think the criticism of risk of inflation has any real probability at this stage here. Overly, over-inflating. I think the issue here is to make sure that the Fed is getting more or less there. I think in the next, in the course of the year, probably the price developments confirm what is anticipated. They will get closer to the 2%. Europe is far behind that, and unless we find a way not to inflate, but to go back to price stability, which is defined as inflation around 2%, it's going to be very difficult to get out of a debt trap that I mentioned before.
Nick Monto.
Thank you. I had a question about one thing that you said in relation to the obstacles for fiscal expansion. You mentioned objective fiscal space that is simply not there. And I wanted to ask you whether and how objective that fiscal space really is. Because the IMF World Economic Outlook models explicitly earlier this month what a scenario of debt and GDP sustainability looks like in what they call the forceful policy response scenario. And they show that forceful fiscal policy actually increases fiscal space because it increases tax receipts, especially given that in the high multiplier environment. That's where the additional tax receipts will begin. So I was just wondering what the Commission and your Directorate's view of fiscal space is, given that if it is objective and constrained, then presumably by by increasing fiscal spending, taking it away, that idea becomes sort of incoherent very quickly. So we're just wondering how the directors read that is.
Okay, no, I think this is a very pertinent question. Actually, there is work ongoing at the IMF on how to come to a definition of fiscal space. Because this is, from a policymaker perspective, it's an important issue because there are disagreements.
Fiscal space is the room for maneuver, right?
Fiscal space is a room for maneuver, exactly. So it's a room for maneuver that you have, that you can, let's say, expand your deficit without basically running into trouble. That is the debt deficit, and indeed you have the box in Article 3 of the World Economic Outlook showing that indeed you can have a certain policy response which leads to no increase in the debt compared to other more passive view in which the debt actually increases more. So this is, but what the IMF is doing now and is going to do in the next months is to come to a more consensual definition of what fiscal space is, so room for maneuver is. Because we have said that we have many different definitions. There are those who take a more, especially in Europe, take a more legalistic view. I mean, if you have deficits which are above 3, you have no fiscal space. If you have debt above 6%, you have no fiscal space. Then others, now I give you my not definition because that sounds a bit too formal, but my initial reaction to your things, to your question, and I think here I think fiscal space should be defined in a situation which as a situation in which one maintains or foster market access, doing away in a counterfactual with the anesthetic effect provided by QE. So now, basically, everybody seems to have fiscal space because interests are so low. I mean, you have ECB buying debt and all that. So this situation here is, I think, this is important from the point of view, the policy is important from the point of view of transmission of monetary policy, stimulation of the economy, etc. But one should not take, from the point of view of policymakers, this as the yardstick to say, okay, I'm at ease, and I should not care about my debt and deficit because in any case, I mean, the ECB is buying my debt, and the interest rate is so low. So I think let's say a criterion of prudence there would indicate that countries with high debt, so with financing needs which are sizable, projecting the counterfactual of QE ending, because at a certain point will end, hopefully, because it means the conditions are better, then I would, in those more normalized market conditions, I'm still at ease and do not run again into troubles that we have experienced back in 2011, 2012. So if you take this more prudent definition, then you can put the countries on the right hand side or on the left hand side.
But you agree that it should be a dynamic definition, that it shouldn't be absolutely set, so it should factor in the effects of fiscal policy itself.
No, I think more and more, and also in our assessment, I mean, second round effects will have to be taken into account. Yeah, I have to say at the same time, I do not believe. I'm not ready to believe fully into the analysis of the World Economic Outlook of last year, where you had public investment, financing itself. In a sort of, let's say, liberal Laffer curve. That I would not, that I think is not fully true.
Hi. Well, first, thank you very much for a very enlightening discussion, for your remarks. It was very interesting. Well, I had a question going back to your original point on essentially the troubling banking system and the lack of basic infrastructure-backed rates across Europe to essentially and potential misdiagnosis. So my question is, given all the regulation changes that are taking place right now, and still the discrepancy across individual countries in the EU, do you foresee potential problems on the capital side in individual markets? Meaning, do you foresee certain shadow system arising due to the lack of financing that used to be coming from the banking side?
Okay, I think we have. Okay, let me. From what I understand from your question, I mean, what we are now for the banking system in Europe in a considerably better position than we were in back in 2008 or 2009. We do not have, let's say, widespread solvency situations in the immediate, I think in the immediate future. I mean, the banks have increased their level of capital very substantially. They are above the regulatory minima and so on. So in many cases, there are high non-performing loans, but they are provisioned reasonably well. So I don't think there is an issue, and I can be discussed. You can have different opinions over in the audience. We discussed a bit over lunch. I don't think there is an issue of let's say immediate threat to stability again. What we have in Europe is this continuing overbanking of so weighted banks. We have too many banks. We have too many inefficient banks. So there must be a process here of restructuring, consolidation, which would increase the efficiency of the system, and which through this process of consolidation you will let's say deal also with the structural issues. In terms of let's say regulatory situation we are in, I think the level playing field is considerably better than, but this is at the international level, not only in Europe. So there is a lot of work to do for the new supervisor. So the SSM is now for over 12 months up and running and supervising the banking system in Europe. And there is a lot to do here in order to put the banking system in a condition or to accompany the recovery through the flow of credit that is needed in order to do so. So I think there is an issue of low profitability that has to be tackled through these restructures. So my view here is, as Mario Draghi indicated very clearly, I think it's right. It's more of a question of let's say boosting profitability, the long haul rather than the threat in the immediate future. The market instability that we had at the beginning of this year, where the slump of the stocks of banks was very pronounced, I think was overdone by the markets. It did not reflect the reality.
Two more hands. I'm going to bundle them together. So this gentleman here and then this gentleman with
Thank you again. Right at the beginning of your presentation, you indicated that one problem which amplified the crisis was the lack of integration of Europe from a financial standpoint, and in some way sounds pretty pertinent to me. But I didn't hear you talk about the steps, pretty clear steps that would be necessary. Neither you, by the way, nor anybody else in Europe these days, about the steps that would be necessary to complete that integration. And so I'm questioning the reason why that is happening. Is that because simply integration, complete integration, is simply not in the cards currently under the political circumstances? And if that's the case, is Europe waiting for the markets to lose faith in the ability of Europe to reach that point and get to the point where it will force Europe to finally integrate or disintegrate.
This gentleman here in the middle.
A little bit the same question, but a different slant, and that's that you described the initial problem as one of a drug addict on low interest rates that created some of these problems, excess loans that were not going to become non-performing. Now, my question is, to what extent does that change in values, change in work ethic, or change in political and social preferences still exist 10 years later? Has that been eradicated in particularly the differences between Southern European countries and Northern European countries?
Okay.
So I think those two
Okay,
small
so very
questions will round things up for us.
daunting questions actually. Now, on the first point on the steps in integration, I think on the financial area it is pretty clear what has been proposed and what is on the table. Difficult negotiations, but I think the path is well sketched out there. I mean, we have to finalize the banking union. We have, and I mentioned that several times, we have the single supervisory system which is up and running and working already. We have the single resolution mechanism, which is the second pillar, also in place, but not fully, because we have the single resolution fund, and in particular the backstop for that still being worked on. So this is the second, and then we have the third pillar on the single deposit guarantee, where the field is wide open. There is a proposal of the Commission, and the discussions and negotiations are ongoing. So this is on the banking union side, and then we have the capital market union I mentioned before. So I think the integration there is well designed. Now, it is difficult because obviously you have a lot of political resistance at each step, but the path is traced. And there is the more general issue of where to go with the integration more generally. And here, the 5 presidents' report of last year indicate that we have to address the issue of budgetary union. I mentioned before, ultimately, the idea of having a euro area treasury. There is the issue of economic union, there is the issue of financial union, which I just said, banking union, capital market union. And then there is the issue of political union, which means not the United States of Europe, not in the foreseeable future, but let's say a more democratic legitimacy for the integration that we have better involvement of the European Parliament, national parliaments, etc. Now, this is the theory. Where is the political dynamics on this? And I fished out this slide here because it describes well, I think, what how the decision making goes for the. When you are hit by big shock like the financial crisis in the first place, this is the reaction by policymakers in Europe. I leave it to you to make the link with what happens maybe on this side of the Atlantic. To a certain extent, there is certain elements of similarity because I think it's the inevitability of the political dynamics. Okay, but what we have here is that the first step is denial, and here is the quote. It's an American crisis, not a euro area crisis. The subprime, you remember where it started. The second one is to say, but correct your fiscal profligacy to the peripheral countries, so put your house in order. And the third one, it's acknowledgement that we have a collective problem, but the reaction is too little too late. This was the initial treatment of the Greek crisis. Both solutions when facing the abyss, and here, indeed, we did make very important decisions. We established the risk sharing, the risk reaction mechanism, so the European stability mechanism, the banking union, and Mario Draghi's whatever it takes. So this was the bolding when we faced really the staring into the deep abyss. And then eventually the situation improves because of these moves here, and what you have is the backtracking. And here the question is, does this describe the current phase? And you can see actually that on the banking union, the resistance to the deposit guarantee or to complete the second pillar is somewhat related to the fact that less of an interest. So I would hope that we are not put in the position to search for yet another crisis in order to make the so the role of the European Commission here, I think maybe the IMF also, but in Europe certainly has, is to have, let's say, a time horizon in our optimization problem, which is, let's say, longer than those of national politicians. So that is a bit what we are struggling to do, and it is not always clearly easy. We have a lot of pushback, but that's what we are trying. So I would hope that wisdom and leadership prevails for the next steps. And on the question of the changing preferences, I think there has been quite a bit of change in preferences. It has been a change in preferences which, to be fair, is more asymmetric than symmetric. And it has been more related to reforms in the south with the labor market reforms, reforms of the pension systems, and many other structural reforms which have been undertaken by Spain, but also Portugal, to a certain extent also Greece, in spite of all the difficulties that we have been encountering. Ireland, clearly the sector reforms, etc. So for those under pressure, I think the change of preferences has started to take place. I think there has been a long way, but asymmetry is again is a state of play, because we know that whatever one sees or wants to achieve, let's say creditors have always can be put under pressure with much more difficulty than debtors. And I think I called mentioned over lunch the setting up of Bretton Woods, and there, I mean, the creditors was the US, and the debtors were in Europe. And if you take some of the pages of those of the rendition there of the discussions at Bretton Woods, and you take what we don't use anymore, this blanket to erase the names and things.
Yeah,
the blanket here, Tippets. You take that and you delete the name of Harry Dexter White or Morgenthau and John Maynard Keynes. You do it with a tippet, and you replace with the names of some of the classic characters in the current debate. The discussion is the same.
Thank you so much. So today's event, like many others this year, is made possible by the hospitality of the Maison Française and the EU's Getting to Know Europe programme. And I have to say that on the face of it, if you wanted to start to get to know Europe, it might not necessarily suggest inviting an extremely serious and senior civil servant to a lunchtime meeting on a very hot day. Except it turns out if you invite Marco Buti, you find somebody who's both personable and seriously intellectually interested and really genuinely, earnestly concerned to answer questions from wherever they come from. And it's been a really thoroughly refreshing and fantastically interesting conversation. Please join me in thanking our guests.